Rose hips are the fruit of a rose plant. They look kind of like berries, and all kinds of roses have hips, including wild roses. Where I live, they're everywhere on riverbanks, along scrubby shorelines and roadsides, and maybe even in your backyard. You might be walking right past them and not even know you've seen them. Hi, friends. My name is Megan, and you're watching my channel, The Kettle, where I talk about how to live a more connected life with each other, with the world around us, and with ourselves. So, today I'm going to talk a little bit about rose hips and why they blow my mind. So, I started foraging as a little kid, and I started off the way a lot of people do with berries, specifically wild blueberries. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. There are a lot of wild blueberries. And so that's something I remember going out looking for with my mom. Other than that, I did sort of what little kids do. I picked things out of the yard, I made potions, pretended to eat them, but I wasn't really searching for edibles and medicinal plants except for wild blueberries. Then as an adult, I kind of expanded that into mushrooms, mostly morel mushrooms. Again, a pretty standard thing. They're very trendy. A lot of people are looking for them around the same time. You see pictures of them everywhere. You see them pop up on restaurant menus. And that was really my adult sort of re-entry into the world of foraging. But it really wasn't until a few years ago where I held a retreat here in Southwest Michigan. And as part of the retreat, I had an herbalist named Carly Pinto. Her business is Nurtured Through Nature, and I'll link to that in the comments. But I had her come and lead us through a foraging walk. So basically, we walked all over a piece of my property and just looked for things that could be eaten or made into medicines that were just out in nature. And this would have been in the fall. I think it was late September that we went on this foraging walk. Now, I didn't expect there to be much out. Honestly, I did not realize at that time that you can really forage year round well into the fall throughout the winter. There are still edible and medicinal plants out there in the world giving of themselves, and I just didn't realize that. So that was one of the first eye openers, was just how many things we were actually able to harvest that day. But the second thing that really, really blew my mind was rose hips because my property was covered with wild rose. First of all, I didn't even recognize those plants as roses. They don't look the same as a cultivated rose like you might see in a garden. I thought they were just some other kind of flowering bush. And the other thing I had not noticed was that these bushes were absolutely covered with these little red fruit. They look kind of like a berry. They're not a berry. I actually think they're not technically classified as a fruit either, but I'm not going to get into that today. If we're using the word a little more figuratively, these are an item that is fruiting from a rose bush. And I had probably just been walking past them my whole life and never noticed. So we went back inside with our rose hips and a bunch of other things we had collected. For example, blackberry and raspberry leaves, which are also abundant in the fall. And we made a few different medicines from them. And we actually put the rose hips into a tea, as I recall. Delicious. So I was so intrigued by this. I ended up doing some research about rose hips and learned that they have up to 20 times the amount of vitamin C in an orange. And another thing that I was so fascinated to learn was that in World War II, because it was so hard for the British to get imported fruit, the government actually encouraged citizens to basically relearn how to forage for rose hips and how to turn them into syrups and things like that because they were so potent and such a good source of vitamin C. And the government was worried that there would be nutritional deficiencies. What I think is really interesting about it, and maybe there's a lesson here, is that that was 80 plus years ago, not a full century, but still pretty far in the past, where we think maybe people were more in tune with nature and their surroundings and maybe had a better understanding of what was abundantly growing around them. And I think that probably is true. I'm going to say in the 40s, they definitely had a better idea than we do today. But the government was still concerned that people wouldn't know how to get their own vitamin C needs met without some education and reminding them of these older recipes that had maybe started to be lost to time. Now, that was 80, 85 years ago. Think about now how much of that information and just that generational knowledge and traditional wisdom isn't just slipping, but is now several generations lost. So that was one thing that was kind of blowing my mind about this story. But the other thing was that in the early 1940s, There weren't supermarkets on every corner, but even at that time, people had still grown really dependent on imports and imported goods. Obviously, now we are very, very dependent on imported goods, and there are big box stores and huge supermarkets and things that someone in the 1940s in Britain wouldn't even have had at their disposal. We've become even more disconnected from these sources of healing and nutrition that are just literally in our backyards. I actually really recommend this book. I've talked about it before. It's called The Herbal Year by Christina Hart Davies. And it goes season by season and it talks about different herbs that might be growing during the different seasons and also what you can do with them. And there's a great section in here about that British campaign during World War II, as well as an adaptation of that original rosehip syrup recipe that the government was promoting. So I highly recommend this book, and I will link to that in the comments as well. I think what this really opened my eyes to is sort of similar to what I was just saying, that we have become really disconnected from these abundant sources of nutrition that are literally just in our backyards. Not only do we not utilize them, but often we don't even notice them. And at the same time, we are paying so much attention to what's being marketed to us, which is often a manufactured replacement for the thing that we could just have for free at the cost of some of our effort, yes, and paying attention, yes, and our time, absolutely. But what we get in return is knowing where it came from. It wasn't being shipped some great distance. It wasn't being harvested under maybe inhumane conditions that we don't know anything about. There wasn't all the energy use and the waste and the packaging that comes along with something being, manufactured in a company someplace really far away and then packaged and sent to us. And then an insane amount of money being spent to convince us that we need it. I don't know about you, but I am personally marketed lots and lots of nutritional supplements these days, many of which are trying to replicate the diverse diet that we're really missing. It's true that many of us are not getting what we need from our diets. And so this isn't a slam against multivitamins or supplements. I think there is a place for those, but there's also a place for just looking around us and seeing what is abundant right in our backyards. Okay, so I'm going to share a couple of different kinds of rose hips so that you can see for yourself what they look like. I showed at the beginning of the video what they look like on the plant themselves, but I have two different kind here that I'm going to try to show you really close. One is from Multiflora Rose. These are abundantly growing on my property in Southwest Michigan. You can see that the hips are pretty small. If you weren't paying close attention, you might actually think they were like a birdberry bush or, whatever we call those. And then these are from a swamp rose, which grow really abundantly in the area of the Upper Peninsula that we have our business in, my husband and I. So we're up there kind of a lot. And over the summer, I saw these everywhere. They're on the riverbank. They were along the shoreline, along walking paths, all over. And these hips are really large, much larger than the others. So they really can look like a lot of different things. All rose hips are edible. The bigger ones are maybe a little easier to work with, especially if you're wanting to do something where the seeds and the hairs have to be removed. I'll show you. There's a lot of seeds in a rose hip, and they're surrounded by these little hairs that can be really irritating to your skin or your gastrointestinal system. So it's easiest to use them in preparations where you don't have to remove the seeds and the hairs ahead of time. Like a tea, if you do that in a fine mesh strainer, then remove the strainer before you drink the tea, you're not going to really encounter those hairs. Same as if you make a jelly or a syrup, because you're cooking down the juice and then you're straining out the seeds and you're straining out the hairs, so you don't have to worry about it. If you were planning to do something where you were going to be, for whatever reason, painstakingly removing those seeds and hairs, which can be done, I think I would recommend trying to find the bigger ones. But again, these swamp roses were everywhere, and this is a great time of year to collect them. I actually saw these over the summer, but waited until we'd had a couple of hard frosts before I picked them, because those freezes will make them sweeter and more flavorful. But I think what I would recommend first is just pay attention. Next time you're out for a walk or in your backyard or maybe in a neighbor's yard or at a park, look around and see if anything looks like a rose hip. When you look closer, you can really tell the difference between these and a berry. They kind of have this oblong shape that ends in this sort of longer stem. But you can also use an app like the Seek app to help you identify the plant as a rose, which will make it a lot more obvious that that's what you're looking at. And of course, I always recommend double verifying before you eat anything that you find in nature or put anything in your mouth. use two different sources to verify what you're seeing. So I will link up some recipes below for syrups and sodas. Vitamin C and therefore rose hips are really good for the skin. So I'm also planning to dry some of these and then infuse them in oil to make a facial oil that can be used for removing makeup or doing gua sha. I really like rose hips just cut in half and infused in boiling water for like 5 minutes to make a really yummy tea. It's kind of tart, reminiscent of hibiscus, but I don't think it's as overwhelmingly tart as hibiscus. It's got a little more sweetness and mildness to it, in my opinion. In a jelly or a syrup, because you're adding sugar, definitely that tartness is going to be kind of tamped down, and you're just going to get that really delicious fruity rose hip flavor coming through. So I'm going to be digging around, looking for some fun ways to use rose hips. Maybe I'll talk a little more specifically about that in a future episode. And I definitely will drop some links. I think the thought I kind of want to close this video with is this. The older I get, the more I'm realizing that what I really want is connection. I want to connect with the world around me. I want to connect with the work I'm doing here, talking to you and the articles that I write for my website. And I want to connect with the tasks that I'm doing with my hands in my home, in my yard, at my shop. I have grown weary of a world that keeps extracting things down to their smallest, most efficient elements and then repackages those elements together and then tries to sell them back to me while spending so much money to market those things to me by telling me that I need them, that I have some lack in my life. I don't have a problem with purchasing products. I buy things, I sell things for other people to purchase, and I really don't have any problem with that. But I just want to feel like as a person, I have a choice. I can sometimes consume things that have been created and packaged and sold to me because I want to, but I have options. I can also look around me and see the different ways that nature or other people, or maybe myself, maybe my own creativity, my ingenuity, my willingness to put effort in, can supply some of those needs or wants for myself. Sometimes, often, and more, I'm finding a lot of the time, I want the satisfaction of finding that thing myself and knowing I can. That feeling of connection to the traditional wisdom that my ancestors would have used, and also just my own agency, my own creativity. To be able to find that source of nourishment growing abundantly, and then to have the knowledge and the desire and I guess the willingness to actually do the work to find it and turn it into something, I find deeply satisfying. And I have a feeling if you've watched this video all the way to the end, you do too. So I'm glad you're here. If you're interested in reading more of my work or learning more about the kettle community, you can find the link for that. That will also be below. Oh, just a quick note. I'm moving these videos to Wednesday because I keep running out of time on Tuesday to get them produced. So from now on, these will be coming out on Wednesdays, and the second Wednesday of every month, the videos will be exclusively for members of the kettle community, and so you won't be seeing a video here on the second Wednesday of each month. But next week is not the second Wednesday of the month, so I will see you right here then. Talk to you soon, friend.